Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shobhankita and I'm a researcher in technology geopolitics with the Takshashila Institution. I'm joined by Anushka Saxena, staff research analyst with Takshashila's China desk. Now that things have cooled down a little bit between India and Pakistan, we've had a heady few days, starting first with the April 22nd terror attack on tourists in Pahalgam, followed then by military escalations between the two nations. Now that things have cooled down a little bit, I thought it would be worthwhile to get a sense of the Chinese perspective on the recent issue across China's foreign ministry, elite opinion, Chinese analysts, and that of the broader Chinese citizenry. Particularly about China's support for Pakistan, its adversarial ties with India, the role it sees for itself in the overall regional stability, as well as the use of Chinese weapons in the recent military escalations. This episode is based on Anushka's recent issue brief titled Mediation and Interference, Assessing Chinese Views and Analysis on the Latest India-Pak Tensions. Anushka, thank you for being here and welcome to All Things Policy.
Thank you so much for having me for this interesting conversation, Shobhankita.
Thank you. Thank you for your issue brief. Firstly, I want to ask you, what are the big takeaways from what the Chinese have been saying, right? So across Chinese foreign ministry, broader elite opinion, Chinese analysts, the broader citizenry, what are the major takeaways for what the Chinese perspective on the recent India-Pak military escalations have been?
Right. So I think at the outset, one thing can be made clear from an assessment of Chinese official views, which is views coming from the foreign ministry, as well as views expressed by elites or those influencing policy either through academic endeavors or through opinion or otherwise. And that one thing that can be made clear is that implicitly or explicitly, China's support is for Pakistan's position. And even though it has disguised its opinion on the flare-up and the tensions as a whole as support for peace, stability, and de-escalation, what I largely mean to say here is that it has nicely gift-wrapped its actual position on the issue as support for de-escalation and mediation, when actually implicitly you see both in terms of official statements coming out of Beijing, as well as academic opinion and citizen commentary, even the media, you see that there is concern for quote unquote flooding in Pakistan's low-lying areas. Simultaneously, there is concern for India apparently cutting off civilians' water supply in Pakistan. There is some boastfulness about how Pakistan's whatever military dynamics may have played out in the hostilities that lasted a couple days. Pakistan's performance was a result of China's military and defense support. So there is some glorification of that, both in Chinese media and in analytical opinion. And there is, of course, on the more official level, also an interest in supporting a so-called international mediation endeavor. And why this again, I connect with my argument about China implicitly or explicitly supporting Pakistan, is because India's first preferred option in resolving the India Pakistan issue has never been to approach an international institution, let alone another country. This is not to say that there haven't been back channel talks supported by other countries between the two sides, but at least that isn't India's preferred option, and India would rather want to resolve it bilaterally now. And this question can go into a whole debate about, oh, how come India came to accept Trump's so-called mediation endeavors, but that's a different discussion. I think the point is that from the Chinese perspective, internationalizing the issue is implicitly, again, a posture that backs Pakistan's kind of calls for help from the international community, right? And again, what we should take with a grain of salt in this pitch of China's to be a mediator is that it has its own interests vis-a-vis something like this. It has to enhance its own leverage and regional legitimacy. If you look at citizen commentaries and popular writings in China, you already see them talking about how China defeated India in the 1962 war and how India is no match for China and Pakistan's weapons combined. And India must take into account that China has kept the heat up along the line of actual control. So India is best to back off. So that kind of colorful warning is combined with the more moderate narrative on bringing peace to the region and kind of mediating de-escalation. And so I think largely these are the conjoined narratives that are coming out of China, and very explicitly you can see how they depict, like I said at the beginning, a support for Pakistan's position and approach to India-Pakistan relations. And I think one assessment that we can make from some of what China has been saying, either officially or through analysis and opinion, is that there are also legitimate concerns that China would face if, say, the India-Pakistan flare-up was to have converted into a long drawn hot war. And so these kind of warnings that China is issuing that, oh, it's defeated India and militarily it's more superior and all of that, to an external reader, and I believe to an external reader, they are supposed to come off as deterrents, right? So by saying these things, China is trying to deter India from taking escalation up many notches because of the concerns surrounding what it may do to Chinese projects in Pakistan, Chinese assets in Pakistan, and what kind of a support will it then lead Pakistan to ask of China, and whether China can service some of those demands or not. So in that sense, you can also see that there is a concern with a full-blown hot war that has obvious implications for regional stability, sure, but also for some of China's concerns. And then those kind of come out as deterrent warnings or warnings that are meant to achieve compellence out of India.
Got it. Got it. So broadly, there's an implicit support for Pakistan, even though it's sort of disguised as advancing the interests of peace in the region. So it is clearly a support for Pakistan. Secondly, it pitches itself as a mediator when in reality it's only trying to advance its own interests in the region. And there is this careful balancing of being boastful with sort of the reality of being cautious about a long drawn war between India and Pakistan, because China also has economic and security interests in Pakistan that it kind of wants to protect. So it's sort of there is a front, and then there is real interests and real sort of motivations and incentives behind some of these statements.
Yeah.
My question to you is this across different communities and different parts of China, or is this particularly across Beijing and the policy circles, or only the academic circles, or only the citizenry? Or do you see these three to be kind of uniform?
Right. I think the kind of analytical atmosphere that exists in China, you can see that there is obvious towing of the official line, although there will be some exaggeration as to what China's interests and capabilities are. But it wouldn't be anything that you would feel is starkly opposed to what Beijing would have to say. And, when I talk about analytical opinion, it appears from institutions in Fudan, in Shanghai. It appears from retired military officials of the PLA or the People's Liberation Army of China. So you do see opinions coming in from across the board. And of course, if you delve deeper into how this opinion plays out and go into the public sphere, if you read about what's being said on Weibo or on QQ or some of these other platforms like Guancha or NetEase, you'll see popular writers are talking about these exact same things. China as a mediator, China as a military power in the region, the support for Pakistan, the problems with India's approach and with India's countermeasures. But the narrative would be much more inflamed, right? Citizen commentators, more often than not, would be the ones who will take it into who will take narrative into a much more aggressive direction, even as some of the Chinese foreign ministry spokespersons like Guo Jiankun or Lin Jian would say things like, there is a need to de-escalate, both parties need to step back. Citizen commentators would be saying things like, oh, India should be forewarned. It's not just Pakistan as a nuclear power that they're dealing with, it's also China, right? And India should remember that it will only take one CH-5 drone, which is a produce of the Chinese Rainbow series of drones. So it would just take one of those for whatever, and Indian jet to go down. So from that sense, media analysts and commentators have obviously across the board, from Xinjiang to Guangzhou to Heilongjiang, all the way to the south to Yan'an, you'll see across the board that the narrative is inflamed and largely against India's approach and interests and in alignment with what Pakistan would have to say. So all of this would obviously be stuff that is state sanctioned, even if it doesn't explicitly seem that way. But at the same time, the nature of the rhetoric would be much more advanced and aggressive than perhaps what would come out solely from Beijing.
Understood. Given that China's support is for Pakistan here, and much of this, actually, all of this started with the terror attack on tourists in Pahalgam. I'm curious to understand how the terror attack on tourists, innocent civilians, really was sort of passed on and sort of whitewashed in the Chinese perspective.
Yeah. I think, and this is, morally the kind of worst bit of Chinese narrative, which is that state media as well as official rhetoric will never refer to the incident as a terrorist attack. And this has been kind of a discussion point across conversations we've had on this, that the first time the foreign ministry statement came out, it said that we condemn all forms of terrorism, and so necessarily they're referring to it as a terror incident. But it's not that straightforward, because in the same breath as them saying we condemn all forms of terrorism, they say that the Pahalgam attack was a shooting incident undertaken by local gunmen, unknown local gunmen. And when the question of the resistance front taking kind of responsibility for it comes up on platforms like Global Times or Xinhua, commentators say that, oh, India isn't acting rationally here because not only did TRF withdraw their claim, they also said that that statement was only put out because there was a cyber intrusion. So maybe India should, give it the benefit of the doubt and take their word for it. So what happens when they refer to the incident as a shooting incident by local gunmen is two things. One is shooting would indicate that it's not an act of blatant terrorism. It wasn't premeditated, it wasn't targeted, and it just happened. And there was no intention behind it, and there were no political or religious motivations. And secondly, when they say that it was by unknown local gunmen, they refused to accept the idea that Pakistan had a role to play in it, right? Even though there is years of history to back up the fact that Pakistan has sponsored terrorism within India, and terror outfits based out of Pakistan and supported by the Pakistani state have had a hand in some of these quote unquote resistance movements. Like, so with TRF, there was support of Lashkar-e-Toiba. With Jaish and Muhammad in the past also, we've seen such groupings being supported. So essentially, the official Chinese statement kind of does away with all of this and asks India to act rationally. And that, I think, is the worst of all the things coming out of China at this juncture. And as you've put it, that then whitewashes the tragedy and the severity of the situation to a great degree. If you go deeper and look at some of the popular posts on Weibo, pardon me, or QQ, citizens have been much more forthcoming in referring to this as a terrorist attack, and in referring to the severity of the tragedy, even as they would have criticized India's countermeasures or its decision to, declare Pakistani military attaches in the embassy persona non grata, or holding the Indus Water Treaty in abeyance. So they would critique all that, but they would acknowledge just how tragic and severe the situation is. But you haven't seen the exact same kind of sentiment expressed by the state. And I think that's where a major chunk of the problem lies.
And somewhere in the call for India to act rationally, would you say there is an implicit sort of a statement that India shouldn't respond militarily?
Oh, totally. I mean, if you combine all of what is being said, that India must emphasize de escalation, and that statement that came out from the foreign ministry on May 7th, I think, which or May 8th, one of those, which was about how India's strikes on terror sites on the 7th May were quote unquote regrettable. You're seeing the need or the Chinese compulsion to extract some sort of de escalation from India. And I don't know if internally this is the sentiment that's expressed because they believe that Indian doctrine or Indian military maneuver would go so far as to decimation or anything of the sort. And I don't know what their assessment of Indian military kind of doctrine is, but and neither would I say that this is an implicit acknowledgement from China that India's military might is just enough to be able to, so to say, defeat Pakistan in a full-blown hot war. But I would say that there are obvious concerns that China would have to address if it does come to a hot war. And so when you see these statements on de-escalation and on how India's actions are regrettable and how it must act rationally and how it must prove by means of an international investigation that Pakistan was indeed behind this. Not only are they, keeping Indian interests and concerns and a history of state-sponsored terrorism from Pakistan aside, they are indeed also attempting to deter India from escalating and raising the costs and threshold of such acts of terror.
Yeah. And despite all of this, we did see military escalation. We had 4 days of military escalations between India and Pakistan. And on the Pakistani side, I think a lot of Chinese weapons were used. I don't know what percentage of what was used. I don't think we even have the full details as yet, but I think it's safe to say that Chinese weapons were used quite a bit by the Pakistani side. And there has been the alleged jet on the Indian side being shot down. I'm sure some of this gets a little more blown up on the Pakistani side and hence the Chinese side. Curious to understand their views on the military escalations, the deployment of weapons, the use of their weapons particularly, if at all, and anything about that jet.
Yeah. On one point before I get into the weapons business, Shobhankita, I think the calculations that went behind the military escalations as part of Operation Sindoor would have had very little to do with narratives coming out of China, and the extent of Operation Sindoor would have been decided based on Pakistan's capabilities, its threshold of retaliation, and India's own two front dilemma and a measure of its capabilities, right? So, until and unless the goal of Operation Sindoor was to indeed go into prolonged conflict, I think China as a concern would have been way at the back of the decision makers' minds. And we can say this confidently in retrospect, because at a lot of the times during the hostilities you saw that Indian sentiment was around, oh, our response will be decided based on how Pakistan chooses to play this out now and how it chooses to retaliate. So I think, I'm sure that measurement would have existed when the plans for Operation Sindhu were made and subsequently executed. So yeah, even though China may have wanted some degree of deterrence, I'm sure behind closed doors, Beijing was prepping for maximum response from India, whatever that would be in their perspective, right? And they know that there is precedent for surgical strikes. They know India has a resolve and commitment against state-sponsored terrorism from Pakistan. So I'm sure internal deliberations and preparations would have been to that tune. Even as to the public, they would want to project that their opinion is that it is not in India's interest to escalate, right? And on to the question of Chinese weapons used, I think we can say for sure that China has had contributions in Pakistan's air defense kind of ecosystem. You know that the JF-17 Thunder, the Block 3, which has been co produced by China and the Pakistani Air Force, has indeed been a tool for Pakistan to project power and capability. So it is likely that was used for evasive maneuvers. The J-10C, primarily its export version, which came in to Pakistan from China, I think about a decade or less than a decade ago, has been another tool in Pakistan's arsenal and has been known to be used in this exchange of hostilities. And of course, there are some ground to air missile systems and air defense systems like the HQ-16, again, the export version, as well as the HQ-9P, which is the export version of the HQ-9 modified specifically for Pakistan. So these are medium and long range air defense missile systems from China to Pakistan. And finally, the bell of the ball has been the PL-15E missile, which again is the export version of the PL-15 developed by Chengdu Corporation or Aviation Corporation of China. And I think with whatever narrative was blown up on the Pakistani side about the downing of jets or anything else, you see that China has quickly latched onto it because it's a question of combat readiness and combat provenness of its weapon systems as used by Pakistan. There is absolutely no official confirmation from China's side or from Pakistan's side about the capacity in which these weapons were used, at what times they were deployed, and neither is there confirmation from the Indian side officially on what the losses were, if any, and what led to those losses, again, if there were any at all. So the speculation on this front can get really tense, but that and can get really speculative. But that hasn't stopped China from boasting about the quality and the war legitimacy of its weapon systems. And this is obviously not officials in Beijing, but this is a lot of analysts and citizen commentators. So if you pick up a platform like Guancha or NetEase and you look at opinions and commentaries, you will see that they're talking in detail about how the J-10CE was, again, allegedly and reportedly able to take down an Indian Rafale And the PL-15E missile was excellent in its radar homing capabilities, so that it was able to find the Rafale, and the Rafale was not able to respond. And some of them are then pitching it to seem as if this is a competition between Chinese-made weapons and Western-made weapons. And on a broader scale, they're talking about how joint exercises between China and Pakistan, such as the Shaheen military exercises, have been the reason why Pakistan knows how to engage in beyond visual range fighting, and how India's dependence on weapon systems from a lot of economies, and not just a single one, has been the reason why its Rafales and its fighters didn't perform well. So they're using all of these tactics to prove why China, both doctrinally and in terms of defense production, has significant advantage and why India does not. And all of this, again, is based on unproven numbers and statistics. Now, one could say that Pakistan would have shared some data with China, but then it should have reflected an official narrative, which it really hasn't. So I think even China is holding its cards, even as the narrative and the misinformation in Pakistan on India's losses continues to kind of rage on, right? And I guess with some of this, it remains to be seen how much is unclassified over the next years. But yeah, that again, like I said, has not stopped China from boasting about its weapons and calling them combat proven. And this also, this is my final point on this, also reflects some degree of insecurity on the Chinese part, because their forces are not battle hardened. They haven't been in conflict for a long time, but they face multiple hostile theaters, both naval and continental. And so, from that perspective, you can understand why they are on a quest to prove that this is a force that can fight. And China's indigenous defense manufacturing capabilities are enough to sail it through against Western powers, implicitly, obviously, the US in maybe a Taiwan Strait conflict or something of the sort. So, in that sense, you should also read this as insecurity reflecting in boastfulness.
Got it. Got it. No, this is very interesting. I think the other thing that gets played up quite a bit every time there's the brink of an escalation between India and Pakistan is the nuclear capabilities of both the nations. And Pakistan has been historically very quick at, sort of putting the gun into its own head and calling nuclear and suicide, right? So, how does this nuclear hot button sort of get played up? Firstly, in the Chinese community, but also broadly in the international community?
Yeah, I think nuclear, the threat or the overhang of nuclear escalation is something that has definitely been worrisome for the international community as a whole, as much as it has been for analysts in both India and Pakistan. And obviously, the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons has got to be extremely high on both sides if either of them care about what is at stake, right? And this is precisely why, you see genuine calls for de-escalation from the international community as a whole, and nobody's really supporting escalation on either side. And that is primarily because you don't want it to reach to the threshold where either side feels motivated to engage in the nuclear business. And this has even been a concern with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Even though Ukraine doesn't possess any nuclear weapons, you still see the international community calling on Russia to really back down on the prowess of its nuclear capabilities, because it may possess them, and all of that is great as a deterrent and for narratives. But it really gets serious when you see maneuvers like the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. And then that really puts entities like NATO and other European countries into action because of the anxiety it creates. So naturally, this is a question. It fundamentally kind of questions the thresholds of India and Pakistan as to how much it takes for either of them to take it to the nuclear brink. And frankly, you don't want to know. And the other thing is that some of this discussion also calls into question the nuclear peace theory, which is that as long as both sides have equal number of warheads, equal capability of decimation, there will be peace by deterrence. But from the Chinese perspective, I think, again, the narrative has largely focused on how India and Pakistan do not fit with the nuclear peace theory. In fact, if you look at this commentary that came out by this entity called South Asian Studies Newsletter, which is a very popular blogging account that talks about South Asian affairs, they are talking about how the red line of conventional warfare between India and Pakistan ends with the nuclear zone. So they will continue fighting to the degree where the only final option that they have is the use of nuclear weapons, which kind of tells you that this is the Chinese assessment of capabilities on both sides, that they can keep fighting till the end. And it also tells you about what they think of whether the nuclear peace theory applies to India and Pakistan or not. And they say that it doesn't, because they have the potential to reach to the brink of using nuclear weapons, and they might just use it because of the kind of frictions that exist between the two countries. And then, you have the more misinformation type conversations happening on Chinese media about how, India attacked some nuclear facility in Pakistan, even though, again, India has clearly refuted any such claims. And I think there's been reportage by the International Atomic Energy Agency that there has been nothing of the sort. That doesn't stop citizen commentators from saying things like, and this is again an amplification of Pakistani narratives, right? So you see Chinese persons talking about, oh, how India is using or stealing leaked nuclear and radioactive materials from Pakistan, and selling them in the nuclear black market. So this is a very interesting one because it just has no head and no toe, right? But it doesn't stop the Chinese from finding ways to A, amplify Pakistani narratives, and B, putting India down. So these are the narratives that you can really laugh at and set aside. But the ones where you see that China continually, or Chinese analytical opinion is continuously reminding India of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, and telling readers that China doesn't believe India and Pakistan are in the deterrence game only because both sides have nuclear weapons. Those are the ones that really tell you about the anxieties that are provoked in China. And I think I was talking about senior officials of the PLA who've been writing a lot. And there is one such commentary from Joe Bo, who is now a research fellow with the Tsinghua University, but used to be a senior colonel in the PLA. He kind of talks about how not only do Pakistan and India have a similar number of nuclear warheads, the fact is that China has about 600. And so if it has to come to escalation in nuclear war, the world should remember that where China's loyalties lie and how many nuclear warheads China has. So if China was to support Pakistan in its nuclear endeavors, you'll know exactly how that goes. And he's doing it in the most circuitous way. He's saying that, the Pentagon estimates China has 600 warheads. So he's not saying that China has 600 warheads. And at the same time, he's conveying the message that he wants to convey, that in the balance of power between India and Pakistan may make it difficult for either side to engage in nuclear war, but they should remember that there is China, and they should know where China's loyalties lie. So that's, again, interesting.
Yeah, quite colorful, actually. I mean, tragically colorful, if you actually think about the consequences of some of these things. But yet the goal is to de escalate and to put pressure on India to de escalate. That seems to be clear. What about the issue of Kashmir? Does this come up at all in the Chinese perspective? Because one thing that may have happened with the recent escalations is again putting Kashmir on the global map and getting the international community's attention towards Kashmir. So, how does this play out inside China? What do they have to say about what we consider to be our territorial sovereignty on Kashmir?
Again, what is not unusual here is their complete disregard for India's sovereignty and territorial integrity when it comes to the Kashmir issue. And of course, it's not just in narratives, it's also in actions, right? They support Pakistan's control over POK. They continue to maintain illegal control over Aksai Chin. And of course, if you look at analytical opinion, especially from people like Liu Zongyi, who again write colorful things and are the biggest India critics, but these are the people that the government listens to and reads from. So Liu Zongyi is a research fellow with SIIS, which is a Shanghai based think tank and is also government affiliated. So these people will also refer to the how bad a decision it was on India's part and the current political dispensation's part to revoke Kashmir's special privileges under Article 370. And the narrative that they spin on this is really worrisome because it tells you about how disrespectful the Chinese are of Indian sovereignty and national interests. And I mean, you didn't need the narrative to prove that. You already have years of examples from skirmishes on the LAC. But even in terms of how much they support Pakistan's side of things, analysts like Liu Zongyi would write that because of the revocation of Kashmir special privileges under Article 370, the current political dispensation in India that has spurred resistance on the ground. They have left no space for Kashmiris to voice their dissent. And that is why you see actors like the resistance front coming up and wreaking havoc in Kashmir, right? So again, not only are you denying Pakistan's role, you're also saying that, India has wronged Kashmiris. And to a great deal, not only does this further India and Pakistan, it sets the two entities farther apart, even if they were inching close on diplomatic resolution. It also undermines the fact that India has kind of done its best to make sure that concerns are heard, democracy plays out just fine, even though it is a chaotic democracy, which again is a continuing theme in Chinese narratives, right? So none of that is being acknowledged. The divide it creates, the fact that India is a chaotic democracy, but a largely functioning one nonetheless. So all of that is ignored, and the focus is instead on how to rile readers up, whether they be in New Delhi, they be in Kashmir, or they be in Pakistan, right? So this is having drastic mental implications for anyone reading it in these three particular regions. And then people start to believe it, and then that can lead to more adverse impact. So that is, I think, the continuing theme and the focal point in a lot of these analytical opinions, that it is India that has caused some of this, and at the same time it is Pakistan that the world should be worried about, because India, quote unquote, also sponsors terrorism in Balochistan. So or ethnic insurgency in Balochistan. So you see how the focus is on critiquing Indian policy and politics as against looking at the history of Pakistani state-sponsored terrorism.
Got it. Got it. So clearly whitewashing the narrative and really taking the side of their all-weather friend, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, just one quick point. Even on Kashmir, like I said, there will again be laughable commentaries, right? You will see people also talking about, and especially on Weibo, you will see some of the popular posts saying, "Oh, if India gives Kashmir as a whole to China, all of its problems are resolved. Its Aksai Chin difference is resolved, and its issue with Pakistan is resolved. And Pakistan and China are already all-weather friends, so Pakistan wouldn't mind." So you'll see these laughable insinuations as well. But it just tells you about the psyche of what people think about the Kashmir issue and how drastically anti-India that is.
Yeah, yeah. My final question to you is China's offer to mediate, which it actually did offer, but like we were discussing early on, clearly the validity of that is questionable because China's interests are purely selfish in nature. It is to advance itself and not necessarily the broader interests of peace and regional stability. But the tweet from Trump, which sort of surprised many of us, calling in the ceasefire and that they had helped negotiate this. And broadly, anything about the India, US, and China relations from the Chinese perspective on this issue that you may have come across.
I think on the question of China's offer to mediate, as we were discussing offline, the insinuation for that came from Pakistani Defense Minister Khwaja Asif's interview with Ria Novosti, which is a Russian state-backed media platform, where he said something like he would love to find an answer to who did this and set India on its path. And for this, he would love some international intervention by Russia, China, or any of the Western countries that would be interested in participating in something like this, right? In figuring out, quote unquote, who was behind the incident. And he also added that Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif supported this proposal. So he went to the international stage, to Russia, and called on all of these actors to kind of support something to the tune of an international investigation and subsequently mediation. Um, Now, obviously, from the Chinese perspective, they found merit in latching onto the idea that Pakistan named China as a potential mediator for something like this. And they continue to emphasize that, they would completely support an impartial investigation. And they left the Western countries bit out, only talked about China and Russia, and said that if Pakistan and India and any international investigators need, China is absolutely ready to play the role of mediator. And then this state narrative was subsequently amplified in opinions and citizen commentaries about how China is mighty powerful and how it can pull this off. And this pitch to be a mediator is not new. You saw this in the past also, when a military vehicle was attacked by Pakistan, I think a couple years ago, in 2022, if I'm not wrong, early 2022. Before that, during Uri and Balakot, also you saw the Chinese talking about de-escalation and mediation, with China wanting to play a role. So this is not new, but Khwaja Asif's statement definitely gave China a lot of material to catch on to and then subsequently make its pitch. But obviously, just like Trump's statement was kind of shocking for both India and Pakistan itself. I don't know how much it was for Pakistan. At least for us sitting here in India, it was quite something. I'm sure from the Chinese perspective also, it would have been both surprising and disappointing. And especially if you look at some of the media commentary coming out on this, you see them trying to delegitimize any role the US may have had in mediating this, or any role Trump may have had in mediating this, by saying that India doesn't like it and India doesn't appreciate it. And this brings me to a broader point about how China looks at the India US partnership, right? From the Chinese perspective, everything is tinted with the colors of its competition with the US. And so if India and the US are proximate and they hold negotiations on trade, or even if JD Vance visits India just for a cultural tour, right? It will really irk China, and then you would see statements to the tune of, these are backbiters. The world should be united against the US. Nobody should be negotiating trade with the US after all that they've done to the world as a whole. And India shouldn't be a pawn in the US's hands. And they say this for everything, right? India's decision to be part of the Quad, India's decision to sign on the Artemis Accords. For all of this, they will say, or with ISET, with INDESX, for all of this, they will say that India is becoming a pawn of the US. So from that perspective, if you kind of try and imply what it would have meant for the Chinese to see that Trump is saying that he mediated a ceasefire between India and US, you would see that they're obviously pissed off about it, and they are telling India to refrain from activities like this, and they're calling out just how hypocritical it would be on India's part to negotiate something like this with Trump, who has been such a cause of concern otherwise for Asian and developing economies as a whole. So I think that's the reflection of how China's competition with the US also kind of coerces it to look down upon other countries' cooperation with the US. So naturally, Trump's kind of role in mediation has been looked down upon, and it has been delegitimized by saying that India doesn't like it and India shouldn't engage in something like this.
So The Chinese clearly use very colorful language, be it in their metaphors, in analogies, in just generally party speeches. So they're generally, quite fun to read. And I thought the same was true of your issue brief. It was quite detailed, but at the same time, quite an easy read. So I'll leave that in the show notes here for our listeners to go through in their time. So yeah, unless you have something specific, any closing comments, questions?
No, I think it's just been an interesting endeavor, equal parts enlightening and worrisome to see how the Chinese have shaped their response up to the India-Pakistan issue. And one thing is for certain is that India should continue looking at and watching some of what is happening in Chinese media and in official statements to formulate its own countermeasures and responses to some of this, and at the same time stay firm and confident in its resolve and endeavor, because at the end of the day, this is a bilateral issue, and there is a history and context that needs to be taken into account while formulating strategies. So that's all I'd
No,
have to say.
absolutely, and there's a lot of value in understanding the mindset, the thinking, the rationale, the incentives, the motivations, the challenges, the strengths, the weaknesses of our adversaries. And so, specifically looking at the Chinese perspective to an issue that otherwise was between India and Pakistan has obviously been very enlightening. Thank you, Anushka.
Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.